Okay, so in the last segment, we talked a little bit about the premise of performance appraisal. And let's talk a little bit about like the overarching goal of performance appraisal. It's really about performance management. According to Denise and Pritchard, performance management is a motivational system of individual performance improvement. So if we think about it like that, like we're trying to motivate an individual to improve their performance over time. You can think about performance management or performance appraisal as just, this overarching step-by-step system where the goal is to get employees to perform at their best and in a way that the organization really needs. So performance appraisal is going to make up part of performance management. Continuous coaching and feedback is another way that we can manage performance. Objective goal setting is an important aspect of these, and we'll talk about that. Developmental planning, looking at how this employee should be developing within the organization over time. So all four of these things are linked to the company goals. So one of the things that's really important for companies, first off, is to figure out what their overarching goal is for their employees. Like where do we want to get as an organization, and how will our employees help us get there? So we need to think about that even before we start the process of developing a performance appraisal tool or a continuous coaching and feedback procedure and things like that. And then, like I said, we want to implement these on a continuous cycle, not just annually. Like employees need feedback. They need to hear examples from across the year. They need to have this going on so that we don't have just one day out of the year where everybody sits down, everybody's kind of scared. No one knows what's going to be said. It's all very anxiety inducing. So if we do it on much more of a continuous cycle, it's a lot more beneficial. So I found another cartoon where apparently jumping through hoops is a very good analogy for how a lot of employees feel about performance management, where it feels like the organization is sort of coming up with criteria. They're coming up with a series of behaviors that the employee oftentimes feels like they had no idea that this was what was expected of them. And we don't want employees to be feeling like that. So things should be sort of laid out ahead of time. The company needs to know what their own goals are, what their goals for each of these different employment categories are, things like that, so that the performance management will be a lot more effective and a lot less surprising. So sources of performance ratings. This is one example of what's called a multi-source feedback appraisal, which is called the 360-degree appraisal. It's called 360 degrees because it's like you've got one person in the middle who's being appraised, and then all around them would be all the people who come in contact with that person. I didn't make this chart, so the fact that the self is not overlapping the center is a little odd to me. But so you've got an individual in the center. They're going to do their own self-evaluation. Maybe if they come in contact with customers, they could do an evaluation of the person, or their peers could. Sometimes you'll even have subordinates. Usually this is for managerial positions where you would have your subordinates rate you. Your immediate superior could rate you. Top management could rate you. Sometimes top management doesn't feel like they know enough about individuals, but if this is a person who's maybe in management, it would make a lot of sense. I wonder if you've ever participated in a 360-degree appraisal. Actually, I can tell you have, because you do student evaluations for classes, and faculty are I don't know if 360 is a good example, but when we're up for evaluation, we have to do a self-evaluation. Our students, who I guess we might say are analogous to customers, evaluate us, right? Those are part of our evaluation package. Our peers are supposed to come in and evaluate us once a year. We have to sit in each other's classes and give evaluations. Our chair gives us an evaluation, so that would be our immediate superior. We even have, usually our dean gives us an evaluation that goes into the folder. So that would be more like the top management. So I'd say, yeah, you have participated in a 360-degree appraisal because you provided evaluations of faculty. You may have done it at work if you have that kind of job. You might have inadvertently done it too by giving feedback to a company, maybe online or something like that, and that might have fed into a customer service agent's 360-degree appraisal based on, the feedback that you gave to a company. So you might have inadvertently provided a customer component into one of these. So you've for sure had at least a student experience with this, and maybe you've done it as an employee and maybe as a consumer. Upward appraisal ratings are ratings by individuals whose status in the organization hierarchy is below that of the ratees. So subordinates are the people who would be beneath, like I said, probably a manager in this circumstance, maybe a supervisor. And you can imagine that feels a little risky to the subordinates, right? I've been involved in 360-degree appraisals. In fact, just this quarter we did one. And so some of our, vice presidents and deans, and I don't know all their names, provosts, stuff like that, we were supposed to evaluate their performance. And as a person who is beneath them in the hierarchical structure, it can feel a little intimidating to do that kind of upward appraisal. And so it needs to be designed in such a way that the subordinate feels secure that their rating is not going to be potentially held against them. Sometimes subordinates are leery even of reassurances of anonymity, right? That maybe you say nobody's going to figure out that this is from me, but maybe my handwriting is recognizable, and you give the person the raw handwritten things. Something that's good for you to know as students, even in those classes where you handwrite on the student evaluations, the department converts that into a typewritten format, and it's provided to the faculty member well after grades are submitted. So there's no way they can figure out who submitted it and stuff like that. So you can feel a little bit safe about that. But if you're nervous, I could see why, right? When you're doing a 360-degree appraisal and you're below the person who they have control over something. In the case of faculty, you might be talking about grades. But if you're talking about at work, you might have a vindictive supervisor who might retaliate if they figure out who did the ratings. So subordinates are kind of a risky source of information. So sources of performance rating. We're still on that multi-source feedback topic. So the basic assumptions about the 360-degree feedback design. One basic assumption is that participants will be happier because they're involved in the process. That's a pretty broad assumption, isn't it? That just because I got to participate, now I feel like I have buy-in. I feel happier because that happened. Some people who are being evaluated, they don't want to write their own self-evaluation. In fact, what I've noticed when people write their own self-evaluations is that they are never as glowing. They're a lot more self-critical than their supervisor or their peers submit. Everybody is always their own harshest critic. There are those people that don't see themselves ever doing anything wrong, but those are unusual cases. A lot of people are very stressed about having to evaluate themselves. Now, this basic assumption is probably true, that the idiosyncrasies or the biases of any single rater will be averaged out across everybody. And so if you're getting a very consistent piece of feedback across the evaluations that are coming from customers and from supervisor and from, superior in the chain of command individuals, if you're getting the same piece of feedback, it's possible that the person receiving this feedback needs to internalize that and think, you know what, it looks like everybody's noticing that. Everybody seems to agree that this is something that I'm really good at or that I'm really bad at. So it's really important for people who receive 360-degree feedback to take it seriously when you have multiple sources providing the same kind of feedback. Now, if one individual says something and nobody else agrees with that, that's also a benefit of the 360-degree feedback. You can see that, okay, I got evaluated by 5 different sources, and one source said this one thing. Okay, I'm going to take that with a grain of salt. That might just be an idiosyncrasy that this person has, or maybe they have a bias against me, and that's an individual problem. Multiple perspectives will give us a broader view of performance. You can imagine where customers would have, they would focus on maybe one aspect of job performance or certain aspects of job performance that maybe supervisors or that top management would not care about. Maybe they're focusing on something else. Peers might be focusing on something else. And so when we look at, overall, if we can kind of put it all together into one big pattern, we might see that we have a richer set of feedback that would allow us to sort of be more nuanced in the feedback that we give to the employee. So you might think to yourself, well, this kind of sounds like we've got contradictory points here in the last two, right? Idiosyncrasies or biases are singled out, are averaged out, sorry. Multiple perspectives give us a broader view. What I'm talking about is two different things, right? So if I have one person who seems to just not like the employee, that is going to get ironed out by the average overall ratings. And that's what I meant by that middle panel. The right-hand panel, what I'm referring to is the idea that customers might notice one set of behaviors, like this person seems really friendly. A peer might notice this person's very efficient and really pitches in. Top management might say, we've noticed a lot of mistakes in the papers that you're filling out, right? Like these might be different things that they're talking about because each reviewer sort of has a different angle on the individual. So how is this implemented? So first off, all parties that are involved need to understand how the ratings are going to be used. It's really important for transparency to tell everybody, this is what we're going to do with this feedback. So a person who's providing a set of feedback needs to know that what you're saying is going to have implications for this person's future, their promotion, their whatever might be happening here in the company. And sometimes people who are just feeling snarky will decide not to be snarky. Oh gosh, this person's job's on the line. I don't think it's really that important. So I'll just talk about what I need to talk about without being such a jerk about it, right? Like sometimes people will actually alter their style when they realize that these are job decisions that are going to be made based on your evaluation. Sometimes people will be worse as a result of being told that. But it's really important for everybody to know how we're going to use this. This person is up for a potential promotion. And so your feedback will be really helpful in our decision. So those kinds of things can really help the process by being honest. Once it's been conducted, you don't just hand the report to the employee and say, enjoy, right? It's important that their supervisor or somebody in the organization sits down with the employee and helps them to interpret and deal with the ratings. I know as a faculty member, the first time I ever got evaluated, they didn't sit down with us to see what the students had said and help us interpret it. And I took every little nuance of anything that sounded negative as a completely personal. And luckily, I'm in the psychology department. And so when I reached out to a mentor, he sat down with me and he said, okay, now let's look at the pattern, right? Like, let's interpret what this means. And it really helped. And I've been teaching for 25 years and it still is not my favorite thing to look at student evaluations, mostly because while there are mostly positive comments, if there's one thing that a student says should have been different or that I did wrong, I completely take it to heart, and it's really hard. And it sometimes would be nice to sit down with a supervisor who says, in context, this is actually a really good evaluation, right? It helps employees. If you have especially somebody who has the ability to make decisions about your future with the organization, sit down with you and help you to understand what these evaluations really mean. Like, what's the big picture? Or almost it's like what the organization is taking from these evaluations. Like, that could be really helpful information, and employees tend to benefit from it. It's important not to sit down and go over every single, average score on every single question, things like that. It can be overwhelming. And the way that the human mind works, if you see a series of questions and you see the individual questions all have their average score next to them, and then there's, let's say, an overall average score for that group of, related questions, the human mind goes right to, okay, why am I higher on this one than on that one? Like, what's the average score on this and how am I placing relative? Like, they're right away thinking a whole bunch of more complex thoughts anyway. So it can be a lot more helpful if like patterns could be provided first. Like, overall, this is our takeaway from your 360-degree evaluation. This is what we're interpreting from it. Here are the high points that I would like to attract your attention to. Maybe these are some areas where you can improve just a little bit, right? Like just give big themes rather than just throwing a bunch of data at the person who's been evaluated. Now, you don't want to do it this much. You missed all of your goals because of poor management, the employee says. I'll go into more detail when I do my 360-degree review of you. I meant to say you're doing great. That's what I meant to say too. So when we do 360-degree feedback, there's always that sort of tit for tat component that might be present. And so when a supervisor sits down with their employee to go over their 360-degree feedback, it's really super important that the employee not feel like the supervisor is attacking them, shaming them. It needs to be very productive. It needs to be sort of specific enough that you're not saying something as crazy as you missed all of your goals, but instead, enough detail that the person knows where they did well and where they did poorly. And then sort of give basic themes, like overarching takeaways. This is what we're concluding, because then otherwise it can be very much where you can get retaliation going on. And so if the organization tends to do 360-degree feedback setups, they need to make sure that it's done with pure hearts. And so there are ways that they can deliver feedback so that people don't feel retaliatory. All right. I think we should stop here because it seems like a little bit of a shift, because we're going to go from these multiple feedback sources to individual sources. So let's go ahead and take a break here, and we will come back in the next segment and talk about graphic rating scales.